It's the middle of summer. Can you believe it's like July 13th? I mean, I turned 51 on this past Wednesday, and so I feel not only, my life is passing me by. What old? Thank you so much. Yes. At least my mother-in-law said I was entering the second half of my life. In other words, I have another 50 years to go. But people like you, Brandon, I hope that Henson is crippled by his shots for even more. So, which I love that, by the way. That was so good. But I just can't believe that it's July 13th. That summer is like we're right in the middle of it. We're right in the kind of the heat in the heart of summer. And I don't know what you think about when you think about summer, but I've always thought of summer as a season that invites us to slow down. That's why schools take a break for the summer. That's why many people go on vacations or lay out by the pool. Even the heat itself seems to drain all of the energy out of us. I mean, don't you just feel a little bit lethargic this type of year? If you don't, just turn your air conditioning off for 24 hours. And you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Because summer has within us, or in itself, this inherent invitation to kind of slow down, to exhale, to kind of move around in a different pace or to change our pace a bit. But the truth is, for many of us, if not all of us, accepting the invitation that summer provides to slow down is almost impossible. Like, it is just so hard. And the reason why it's so hard is because we have so much to do. There's so many things on our to-do list. There's this relentless pull towards busyness. That's why we always answer when someone says, "What's going on?" You just say, "Oh, I'm busy," like you're really proud of it, But we all live with this tension between our to-do list and all the things that we have going on and the invitation to pause, to exhale, to slow down. But what if this summer, instead of just life as usual, what if we could choose to lean into a practice that could radically transform how we live? Not just over the summer, but could radically transform every season that we're going to. That it could somehow reshape our weekly rhythms. What if we could somehow incorporate a practice of intentional slowdown into our week that could change us, that could transform us from the inside out? Well, the good news is the Bible actually has a practice that it talks about, that God has instituted, where we are invited to slow down each week, to pause each week. It's the practice that we call Sabbath. Now, I know Sabbath, some red flags pop up, or some of you just hang in there. You'll see what I'm talking about in just a little bit. But the Sabbath is really this weekly rhythm that God has given to us that has the potential to restore our souls, to reshape us from the inside out. See, the invitation of Sabbath is about us clearing out some space, carving out some space so that God can form us into the kind of person that he has created us to be. I think that Sabbath not only creates space for God to form us into who he's created us to be, but I think that the Sabbath creates some space for us to become the kind of people that we all desperately want to be. So over the next few weeks, we're going to do some deep dive into this invitation of Sabbath, the invitation to slow down. Now, to set the stage, I want to look at a very familiar story. That's a story that has been foundational for my life. Actually, decades ago, this story reshaped how I function as a follower of Jesus. The story is found in Luke chapter 10. So if you have your Bible, you can open up to Luke chapter 10. If you're on the YouVersion Bible app, you can go to the events section. All the notes from today are on there. We're also going to put this up on the screen. But I just love this story. Let's start off and we'll look at what it says. It says this: as Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, they came to a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. Her sister Mary sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he taught. But Martha was distracted by the big dinner that she was preparing. Now, I just love this scene. I mean, can you imagine what it would have been like to have Jesus over to your house for a meal? I mean, what an incredible honor. If you're like me, I'd pull out all the stops. I would make the best meal I knew how to make. I would want everything to be perfect, and that is exactly what we see with Martha. She is preparing this big dinner. There's so much to do, but because there's so much to do, she needed help. But here's her sister, Mary, who's just sitting around listening to Jesus teach, And here's something else I find fascinating about this story is both of these women, Mary and Martha, they both loved Jesus. They were just showing that love in different ways. Martha was showing her love by doing something for Jesus. Mary was showing her love by sitting with Jesus. And I think that that's really a great illustration of a struggle that goes on inside all of us who are followers of Jesus. There's this struggle, this tension that we live with between doing and being. And there's so much to do, and there's so much we want to do. And maybe we even want to do it for the right reasons. But there's this struggle that we can become just like Mary and get distracted with all that we have to do. And it's not like the doing is wrong. It's not like the doing is sinful. But like the story tells us, Martha, in all of her doing, was distracted. That was really the problem with her doing. It was all this preparation that she was doing for Jesus was actually distracting her from Jesus. And I think if most of us are honest, we struggle with the same thing. I mean, think about all that we have to do, all of our busyness, all of our tasks, all of our to-do lists. They distract us from Jesus often or most of the time. And it's not like those things that are on our list are bad. Actually, those things that are on our list, most of them are important. Some of them are necessary. We can't not do those things, right? But the problem comes when all that we have to do distracts us from the most important thing. And that's what's going on here with Mary and with Martha. Well, another reason I like this story is because Martha's a lot like us. When we get distracted and we get busy, we get frustrated because things don't always work out the way we want them to work out. And so Martha, in her frustration, invites Jesus to take her side. Look at how it reads this next. It says, she came to Jesus and said, Lord, doesn't it seem unfair to you that my sister, Mary, it just sits here while I do all the work? Tell her to come and help me. I just love it because Martha is just like any 3-year-old. It's not fair, right? She just wants justice. And it's not just because Mary's just sitting there and she's doing all this work because there's all this stuff to do. And so she has this genius plan. I'm going to get Jesus on my side. And so she goes up to Jesus and asks him to take her side, to basically tell her sister Mary to get off her butt and do something, right? So how is Jesus going to respond to Mary or Martha's invitation? It says, but the Lord said to her, my dear Martha, you are worried and upset over all these details, but there's only one thing worth being concerned about. Mary has discovered it, and it will not be taken away from her. Now, let's be honest, Jesus kind of rebukes Martha a little bit here. But don't you just hear the compassion and love in his voice? My dear Martha. Some translations say, Martha, Martha. You can feel the love. You can hear this concern and this compassion that he has for Martha, but he doesn't side with Martha. Instead, what he does is he redirects her to what is most important. Notice what he says. There is only one thing worth being concerned about. In fact, will you say that phrase with me? Because it's really important. Here we go. There is only one thing worth being concerned about. Let's say it one more time. There is only one thing worth being concerned about. To which you want to raise your hand and go, but I have a really long list. And I have a lot that I need to do. And there are some responsibilities that I can't let go of. But Jesus looks at you and me just like he looks at Martha and says, you are worried and upset and distracted by so many things. But there's only one thing worth being concerned about. In other words, the most important thing isn't the big meal for Martha or all that has to be done for us. The most important thing is figuring out how to slow down and be with Jesus. And Mary in this story gives us a great example of what that looks like. And so the question for us over the next few weeks is, how can we be a little bit more like Mary? How can we be a little bit more like Mary? How can we stop worrying and being upset over all the details, even the important details? How can we stop being distracted by everything that we have to do, even though we still have to do some of those things? And how can we arrange or maybe rearrange our lives so that we don't miss out on the one thing that is worth being concerned about the most? Well, I think this is where the practice of Sabbath can be extremely helpful to all of us if we will be willing to take a risk and put it into practice. Let me tell you what Sabbath is. The word Sabbath comes from the Hebrew word that means to cease or to stop working. Maybe you've heard it say Shabbat. That's how you say it in Hebrew. It just means to cease or to stop working. But literally, what it talks about is doing nothing related to your normal work for a full 24-hour period each week. That is, that it's setting aside an entire 24-hour day or period, making it separate from the other 6 days, and doing nothing that is related to your work. And I think that what happens when we do this, when we practice this weekly rhythm of Sabbath, it helps us to reorient or reshape our lives around that one thing that is worth being concerned about more than any other. And what I find fascinating about this talk of Sabbath is I never heard a sermon about it at all growing up. And I've been going to church since I was born. Now, I know some of you have different stories. You came from maybe some more legalistic backgrounds where if, Sabbath was practiced very strictly. And if you veered off of that, whatever, you got smacked. Alan knows what I'm talking about, We'll talk about that over the next few weeks because that I don't think is what the Bible's talked about. But I never heard anybody talk about Sabbath. I mean, sure, you weren't supposed to cut your grass on Sunday, right? Or, you're supposed to go to church on Sunday or whatever. But this whole idea of what the Bible talks about when it talks about Sabbath, never ever heard anybody talk about growing up. So I don't want that to be the case for you because the truth is this whole idea of Sabbath is all throughout Scripture. Old Testament, New Testament. You're going to see it in the life of Jesus. And Jesus reshapes the whole idea of Sabbath, which you're going to talk about in a few weeks. But the practice of Sabbath was instituted way back in the creation story. You know this, right? Even if you're not a Christian, you probably know a little bit about the creation story, that God created the world in 6 days, and then what did he do? He rested. He took a break. He worked for 6 days, and then he rested for a day. On Sabbath, we imitate God by stopping our work and by resting. And I would argue that this whole idea of having a rhythm of work and rest, because of what God instituted in creation, it is baked into all of our DNA. Think about it for a minute. Every single day, you practice the rhythm of work and rest. You're awake, and then you sleep. Some of your sleep is not very restful, but it's still there, right? And I don't know if you realize this or not, but this is fascinating. I was just taking some time to be silent before God and kind of focusing on my breathing this week. And I realized that when I'm at rest and breathing normally, that there is a natural pause at the end of every exhale before I inhale. Have you thought about that? Some of you are not going to do anything else the rest of the morning except breathe and focus on that. And if you just go, you're going to hyperventilate and pass out, and I'm going to be like, told you so. There's a natural break, Why? Because there is all of us baked into our DNA is this natural rhythm of work and rest. It's even in our breathing. It's pretty amazing. I see some of y'all taking deep breaths. It's great. It's funny. See, you were created to practice Sabbath. But like I said, I know when some of us hear the word Sabbath, we kind of push back, or maybe we put up a wall or something because of a past experience that we have, or maybe some of us push back against the idea of Sabbath because the whole idea of a 24-hour period where we stop from our normal work, man, it just cuts at the core of who we are. It cuts deeply into our lifestyles. And you know what? You are extremely right about that, because the practice of Sabbath is radically countercultural. And unfortunately, because it's so countercultural, in our culture, it is very, very difficult for us to put it into practice. I mean, think about it. Our culture knows nothing of setting aside a whole day, a 24-hour period, to stop work and to rest and to delight in God. Now, that wasn't the case for a long time. And, remember, everything used to be closed on Sundays. Some of you remember back to those days. Others of you can't imagine a time where things weren't open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? But there was a time, if you go visit Europe right now, many things are closed on Sunday, not because it's, they're trying to take a Sabbath. It's just they recognize the value in this weekly rhythm of work and rest. But in our culture, man, that is a foreign idea. And even in the church, think about it. Sabbath is often considered, it's just an optional extra, maybe for those weirdos or for those super spiritual people or something like that. So it's not anything that's essential to my discipleship or anything. But I would argue that the practice of Sabbath is extremely essential to our discipleship. Because without it, we are going to miss out on some key things that God wants to do for us and that God wants to do in us. And the reason why some of us struggle, I think, a lot of times being more like Martha and less like Mary is because we don't know how to do this. We don't know how to put this practice of Sabbath into practice. So we're going to talk about that. So it was instituted in creation, and I don't know if you realize this or not, but Sabbath is actually a command, right? Like we are commanded to practice the Sabbath. If you remember, it's one of the 10 commandments, and not only is it one of the 10 commandments, it is the longest and most detailed of the 10 commandments. I know you have all the 10 commandments memorized, but in case you've forgotten, I'm going to show them to you. I'm going to show you not commandment 4, which is the Sabbath, but just to kind of compare the 9 that aren't about the Sabbath, 1 through 3 and 5 through 10 say you should not have any other gods, not make for yourself an idol, not misuse the name of the Lord your God, honor your father and mother. Kids, remember that one. You should not murder, should not commit adultery, should not steal, should not give false witness or lie, should not covet, right? Those are those. Now look at commandment 4. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. That is set apart. That means different from the other 6 days of the week. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord our God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. That's not like an alien from Mars. That's like foreigners who are living among you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. He set it apart. He made it unique. There are more words in that one commandment than in all the other 9 commandments put together. What that says to me is this is pretty important. It's probably something that we should consider. It's probably something that we should figure out how to put into practice. But here's what I find fascinating about Sabbath. It's not just a command we're supposed to obey. See, that's the problem that many of you who grew up in a church that forced a Sabbath, that was the problem. It was a command that you were forced to obey. We're going to see that Jesus had the same struggle with some of the religious leaders in his day. They had strict parameters on what you could and could not do on the Sabbath, right? And anything out of that, man, you deserve to be stoned, basically, because of that, And so that there's a struggle. But the good news about Sabbath is it's not just a command that we obey, but is a gift that we are invited to receive. And I think this is what makes Sabbath so fascinating to me, that it is a gift. In fact, remember the context of when God issued the command to take a Sabbath, to practice Sabbath within the 10 commandments. Remember, the Hebrews, they had lived as slaves in Egypt for over 400 years, which meant they never had a day off. They were treated as tools for production. Basically, they were just doing machines. They worked 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Now imagine just for a minute, if you work 7 days a week, 365 days a year, how deeply ingrained overwork would be inside your DNA. And not only that, how exhausted you would be. But you wouldn't know any different because that was just how it was. That's how it was for your parents. That's how it is for you. That's how it's going to be for your kids, right? Here it is. These people, they never, ever observed a rhythm of work and rest. And they were never allowed to practice a rhythm of work or rest. They didn't have the ability to make a choice about it like we do. Because for them, living meant work. And one day just blurred into the next. And I think many of us in this room can relate to that a little bit. That's kind of how our lives function. We don't really understand this at times. But when God called the Hebrews out of Egypt, he reminded them that they were unique and sacred human beings who had been made in his image. And he gave them all these laws to remind them how to live according to the way he designed them to live as human beings. And one of the laws that he gave them so that they could live according to how he made them to live involved both work and rest. It was the fourth commandment, the commandment to Sabbath, to cease, to stop from your normal work, to make one day separate from all the other days of the week so that you could refocus and recharge. It is a gift. But not only is the Sabbath a command to follow, a gift that we receive, but it's also a light to the people around us. Remember, after the Israelites get to the promised land, right before they're about to go into the promised land, Moses reminds them that if they will continue to practice Sabbath, it will be a light to the surrounding nations and a sign to the surrounding nations that God had freed them, that God had liberated them, that they were no longer defined by what they did, but they were defined by who they were as God's chosen people. I think the same thing is true for us, that we can be the same kind of light and the same kind of sign to our overworked and overbusy culture where we are distracted by so many things, that we have been called out of that lifestyle. We don't have to prove our worth and our value by what we do, because we have worth and value because of who we are. We are made in the image of God, and because we are made in the image of God, we can stop, and we can rest, and we can cease from our work, and we can Sabbath. See, that is why the Sabbath invites us to build this idea, which is hard to grasp, I understand, the idea of doing nothing into a full 24-hour period of time. Now, some of you, the idea of doing nothing, you're like, heaven. And others of you, you're like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do while I'm doing nothing? You know, you're starting to have tremors. You know, we'll talk about that over the next few weeks. But the whole idea of doing nothing, it seems so inefficient, unproductive, and useless to many of us, right? But I love what one theologian said. He said this: to fail to see the value of simply being with God and doing nothing is to miss the heart of Christianity. To which you might go, well, I don't really understand that. Well, remember what you are saved by. You are not saved by what you do. You are saved by what has been done for you by Jesus. The idea of doing nothing for your salvation is at the heart of your salvation, which I think should maybe encourage us and motivate us to be willing to maybe do nothing for one day of the week, or at least do nothing related to our regular work. See, I think in affirming and observing the Sabbath, we remind ourselves that we are not in control of the universe and that everything doesn't revolve or depend on us. We actually, by stopping from our normal work, remind ourselves that it is God who is in control of our normal work. And he gives and he takes away, and he is worthy to be praised no matter what. And in stopping and in ceasing, we're able to remind ourselves that God is the one who's at the center of everything, and that God is the one who is the source of everything. It's that powerful. One of my favorite authors, Eugene Peterson, he's the guy who paraphrased the Message translation, which many of us read for devotional purposes and stuff. He talks about the Sabbath a lot, and he says that the Sabbath has been one of the most abused and distorted practices in the Christian life, which I would say is true. I've seen that. Some of you have experienced that. But he says, even though it's been one of the most abused and distorted practices of the Christian life, we can't live without it. I love what he says here. He says, Sabbath is not primarily about us or how it benefits us. It is about God and how God forms us. I don't see any way out of it. If we are going to live appropriately in the creation, we must keep the Sabbath. I love that. And he reminds us that there are some great dangers in practicing Sabbath. Things like legalism, like I said, we're going to talk about. Another problem is, what about those who have to work on Sundays or on what you would consider a Sabbath? What do we do about that? We'll talk about that too, because what we're going to discover is that the practice of Sabbath is not like the command to not murder. We know what murder is, right? Don't kill another person, right? That's what murder is. Sabbath is not a one-size-fit-all command. In fact, I think that what is so amazing about this gift of Sabbath is it's an invitation to come up with a unique plan that's unique to your circumstances, to your family and life situation, to your work situation, that where you are stopping and ceasing from your work, but it's unique to you. That's why you can't be legalistic about it, because the plan that works for you may not work for me. And the plan that works for me might be irrelevant to you in your season of life. I mean, Liz and I are getting ready to be empty nesters. I mean, Levi moves out in 3 weeks from Thursday. There's not a countdown or anything, but there is. Actually, is it 4 weeks from Thursday? It's 4 weeks. Doggone it. But I'm not rushing. It's not rushing. But, our plan for Sabbath is going to look a lot different than Tara and Brandon and Ophelia walking around in her walker, and Henson being carried around because he got shots, right? You have to do things differently when you have young children than when you have no children at home. So you're going to have to come up with a unique plan for you. We're going to talk about how to do that. But what we're going to see over the next few weeks there are some principles that can guide us as we put together this unique and personalized plan for practicing the Sabbath. I would say that these principles are actually countercultural practices that can help us put together a plan for Sabbath. And they're this. They are to stop, to rest, to delight, to do good, and to worship. I think whatever plan we put together for how we're going to put into practice Sabbath is going to involve 5 things. Stopping from our normal work. Now, like I said, the normal work. Whatever your job is, stopping from that, ceasing from that. But not only stopping from that, but resting, which some of us are really good at. And others of you, we struggle with that. But when I talk about rest, what restores you? What renews you? What brings life to you? And then delight. What are things that are really fun for you, that are enjoyable, that just fill you up, And then doing good. We see that with Jesus. The reason why people wanted to kill Jesus is he kept doing good on the Sabbath. Our Sabbaths should involve doing good for other people. They're not just about us. They are opportunities for us to serve other people in ways that are different than how we serve the other 6 days. And then worship. Sabbath is an invitation to take some intentional time over a 24-hour period and turn our attention and our affection to God. So, like I said, we're going to talk about these over the next few weeks and how to put them into practice and how to begin to incorporate them so that we can live out this practice of Sabbath and learn how to slow down and trust God more so that we can become more who He has created us to be. But for now, today, I don't want you to come up with a plan. Today, I just want you to think about the story of Martha and Mary for just a little bit. And as you think about that story, I just want you to think, who am I more like? Am I a little bit more like Martha? Or am I a little bit more like Mary? Or maybe I'm a little bit like Martha in this area of my life, and it's causing me to be distracted from Jesus, Or maybe I'm just like, I'm a little bit more like Mary just for like an hour on Saturday morning, But who are you more like in the story? And then here are some other questions I want you to consider. How much of your life is consumed with the distractions of all that you must do? Have you ever thought about that? Like how much time is consumed by all of the distractions? Because all of us have distractions. And like I said, all of us have things that we need to do. And they are important things. But how much of our life is distracted by all that we have to do? Because I think there's a way that we can do all that we need to do and invite God into the process and not be distracted like Martha was. But that's, like I said, a whole nother topic for another week. And then the next question, do you have any space or time where you can focus on the one thing that is most important? Your relationship with Jesus. Do you have any time? Some of you do. It's a regular part of your day. Maybe some of you are already practicing this whole idea of Sabbath. I hope that if that's you, this is going to be an encouraging next few weeks as you realize that you are moving in the right direction. But do you have time or space in your week, in your day, where you can focus on the one thing that is most important? Can you imagine if Jesus were to look at you and say, Jonathan, my dear Jonathan, you are worried and upset about so many different things, but there's only one thing worth being concerned about. Why don't you just focus on that? I think that Jesus is looking at each of us this morning and saying just that, which is why I want to invite you this week, not only to answer those questions, but to pray this simple prayer. Jesus, show me how to incorporate the practice of Sabbath into my weekly rhythm. Jesus, show me how to incorporate the practice of Sabbath into my weekly rhythm. I want to give you an opportunity to pray that right now. So why don't you just close your eyes? And why don't you just ask Jesus to show you how to practice the Sabbath? And maybe you can kind of, in your conversation, you can have some pushback towards Jesus. And just tell him about all you have to do. And it's not like he doesn't know, but I think something beneficial happens when we tell him about all that we have to do. That's why Peter invites us to cast all of our cares on God because he cares for us. But would you have the courage to say, Jesus, show me, teach me how to incorporate this practice of Sabbath into my weekly rhythm. Help me to come up with a personalized plan. Heavenly Father, I'm excited about what you're going to teach us over the next few weeks because I want us as followers of Jesus who are part of Hub City Church to live different from the culture in which we live. And I think one of the most countercultural things that we could do to live different is to practice Sabbath. But the last thing I want, God, is for us to practice it in a legalistic way or in a prideful way or in a way that makes us look down on others who aren't practicing it. If we do that, then just, you can just zap us because I don't want us to be like that. I want us to practice it in a way that is for our good and for others' good so that you can do the work that you want to do in us, transforming us, reminding us that we are not in control and the world works just fine without us. By reminding us that there are some things that you want to do in us and through us that can only be done if we are incorporating this practice into our weekly rhythms. Teach us, God, how to work well and to rest well. Help us over the next few weeks to come up with a personalized Sabbath plan so that we can be obedient to you and so that we can receive the gift that you have for us and so that we can actually be a light of difference to the world around us. We love you. Thank you for this. In Jesus' name, amen.